Hello and welcome to the Cambridge PhDcasts. Today I'm talking to Michelle Wallis, who's a PhD student in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science. Now, Michelle is a special one because, as we found out, she actually has 2 degrees. She has a degree in medieval history and a degree in molecular biology. So she's the ideal person to talk to us today about a really fascinating topic. She's going to talk to us about medical advertising from about 1660 to 1720. So Michelle, if you'd like to give us an introduction to the topic.
Okay, sure. I always like to start out, I say to people, I work on early modern advertising, and they go, oh yeah, advertising. What sort of advertising? Newspapers? And so the first thing I would like to tell you is that I don't work on newspaper advertising. There is a very small amount of it in the period that I'm talking about. More like news sheets than newspapers the way that we would think about them, though you do get some towards the end of the period. What I'm talking about is what I'm going to call handbills. So we're talking about like single sheets of paper generally. I have some like small pamphlets as well, but they're mostly single sheets of paper. They range in size from about like the width of a piece of A4, but 2/3 the height, to something about the size of a business card. So that you could like slip to somebody subtly in the street or something like that, or have in a little package or something. And so my PhD is kind of focused around 3 very rare collections of these, because they don't generally survive, that are in the British Library. And I have, well, there's over 600 handbills in the collection. I have about 512 of them that are medical. And I use these to sort of explore medicine, and sort of like medicine at the popular level, like what the ordinary man would be doing in this period. And like I said, they're really rare survivals. So something that I'm really trying to get at is where they come from, you know, how people distributed them and things like that. And, you know, also sort of like a sort of framing question is like, why have we got these ones and not any others? Like, what happened to the others? And why is it all of a sudden that around 1660, which is when we think these collections started, somebody decided to book them, like stick them in an album and decide that they were something that was worth keeping?
And what made them something that you keep? That's fascinating. So, well, I mean, to start with, give us an idea. So you've given us an idea of kind of the size and shape of these things. What do they, I'm sure they're very varied, what kind of material do they include? What kind of information do they transmit? Okay,
so they're generally advertising both medical practitioners and medical products. So a typical one might be like, at the sign of the hand and urinal, you will find a doctor or a German doctor or German practitioner, or a university doctor. A lot of times they don't have names, but some of the more famous ones will, like Dr. Case is quite a famous doctor who includes his name in his handbills. And then he'll say, I specialise in all these different kinds of diseases. They'll say like gout or children's diseases. Women's complaints is a big one. We have some that sort of will be like, the doctor specialises in this, this and this, but if women would like to come and consult with my wife, then I have her here as well to help them out. A big theme of them as well is venereal disease, which, especially syphilis, is very sort of prominent at this time, and it's something that you get a lot of advertising for. And then the other side of that is, and especially towards the end of my period, you get an increasing emphasis on the sale of drugs. And really these documents are the very first evidence we have of the rise of what will become in the 18th century patent medicines. So medicines that have a brand name, though the branding comes just after my period. Though here you start getting them maybe associated with somebody's name, Blagrave's Spirit of Scurvy Grass or something like that, Scott's Pills, Anderson's Elixir, that sort of thing. You sort of get those coming as well. And then a small element of this collection, but is kind of a larger issue beyond that, and especially on the continent, which I don't go into because my collections focus on London, medical technologies like trusses. I have very few for that. So these are something that you don't really get nowadays, but it's like a sort of like metal and leather contraption to hold your hernia in.
Oh God!
Yeah,
really?
Yes,
that sounds absolutely delightful.
Yeah, and sort of strappings for crippled legs or missing legs and things like that.
Okay, but these are less common than particular products or practitioners?
In my collections, yes, though it's really hard to know how representative these are, because get back again to what I was saying in the introduction about why these were collected. I think there's definitely a bias in the people, whoever the person is that's collecting these, and I have some inklings about that, but I'm not sure. I think that probably wasn't one of their primary interests. The ones on trusses that I do have are there because they're, I think they're there because there's a sort of controversy. Somebody is sort of imitating somebody else's bills. He's bought, or he's at lodgings a couple of houses down from someone else, and he's trying to steal his business. He's printed out very similar bills using the same device, which is like a buoy, and in a truss, and he's essentially sending people out in the street to steal the business.
So the device being a logo, essentially, which you would recognise.
Exactly, yeah.
So there's a large and growing field in the history of medicine, the history of science, right? Which obviously this is a contribution to. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the state of debate and how you envisage your work fitting into that?
Okay, so my work kind of fits under this sort of umbrella of this term, the medical marketplace. And I just want to step back for a moment and let you know how we in the early modern history of medicine in particular got to this idea of thinking about the medical world in London in particular and England and Europe more generally as a medical marketplace. So the history of medicine was kind of originally something that was done a lot of the time in the spare time of actual doctors and so on. And partly for that reason and for a whole lot of other reasons, especially to do with sources, it focused a lot on institutions like the College of Physicians and the guilds for apothecaries and surgeons and barber surgeons and so on, partly because, they have sources, but also because people were looking back at this sort of prejudice point of view that we try so hard to get away from now, looking back at the past and sort of imposing these professional categories.
So imagining a kind of corporate identity and imagining regulation.
Yes, exactly. Well, assuming that there were these discrete identities. And in that they're very much encouraged by a lot of the sources. So particularly the College of Physicians in this period would like to think that they control medical practice in London. They say in their statutes that they do control medical practice in London, I think 5 miles outside the city walls. But that's not actually the case. Regulation is very ineffective. There are several overlapping spheres. You can get a bishop's license to practice medicine. You can get a license from the king or the queen, lots of changes of dynasty in this period, to practice medicine, and nobody really controls it. And so actually a lot of sources that I use are sort of polemics against the state of medicine and so on in this period and how it's badly regulated. So in the 1980s, when we get to the sort of social history of medicine, we're trying to get away from these neat institutional histories with, you tell the story of apothecaries becoming pharmacists, you tell the story of surgeons becoming, or barber surgeons becoming modern surgeons, you tell the story of doctors of the College of Physicians becoming doctors now. We're trying to get away from that and think of other ways of thinking about medicine in the period, getting away from the practitioner's point of view, trying to get at the patient. What are patients thinking about? And one of the ways in which people have done that is use this term, the medical marketplace, which I might add has been the subject of quite a bit of controversy since it first came up, because it misses out a lot of the way in which medicine was practiced in this period. You don't get to the sort of medicine that's practiced without a commercial transaction, so in the home, in family and kinship networks and so on and so forth. But that said, it is an incredibly useful category for what I'm talking about, because it has these concepts of the idea of the early modern person as an active patient, somebody who could be especially at the gentry and literate levels, as informed as someone who has even been to university and studied medicine. They're reading the same texts and so on, and they're making active choices about their healthcare. It's not you go to your doctor, he makes a decision and refers you on. It's more shopping around and this sort of idea of the marketplace and active consumerism.
So it gets us a lot closer to the actual experience of healthcare and its provision.
Yeah, exactly.
So these are absolutely fascinating sources, I think, in early modern print, which is such a interesting area to study as well. I suppose I'm going to ask, what kind of a source are they? I mean, how do they relate to printed books, other kinds of print in the period?
Okay, well, I've presented a lot of book history conferences and things like that, and I like to say to people, I'm going to lower the tone now. This is the cheapest of cheap print. These were given out for free. Some of the pamphlets you might pay a very small amount for, but generally they were given out for free. And, that has huge implications for survival, because, for instance, they were used as toilet paper.
Oh, lovely.
So like I have a little quote from one of them, if you would like. It's like, it's being a little bit, euphemistic, but trust me, this is what they're getting at. And so he's addressing the reader, and this is like a common sort of rhetorical trope that you get in these. He says, "Reader, be not so injurious to thyself as presently to commit this paper to the worst of officers. It designs their good, therefore first read. 3 minutes performs the task, after which use thy discretion."
That's wonderful. Instructions for reading. So these get used for the worst of offices as well. I think you mentioned to me before, these get used to light fires.
So
that has huge implications. That's why we don't have that many of them left over.
Another thing that they get used for is they get bound into other books as printer's waste.
Okay.
So this is the point at which I'd like to command this audience and say, if you find one of these, email me, because like one of my best discoveries has been thanks to a very sort of, just generally amazing cataloger at the University of Cambridge here at the UL, who catalogued one of these bound into a completely unrelated text as a separate item, so I was able to find it, and that told me an awful lot about distribution networks outside London, because now I can say that this guy who had a whole series of these had one version for London and he had one version for the provinces. It has completely different
fantastic
retailers, and it goes as far as the north of England.
Oh, brilliant. So keep an eye out next time you're flicking through early modern printed collections. We want to hear from you. There's not a number at the bottom of the screen. I'm sorry.
Google me.
Yes, exactly. And we'll have contact details obviously with this as well.
Yeah.
So who are the people who are throwing these into fires and bringing them into the privy? Who are the audience?
Yeah, okay.
For these?
Difficult one to get to. So first of all, there's a question of literacy, which is obviously very difficult to get at in this period in particular. So we are obviously talking, at least in part, about people who can read. Though of course they would be the most accessible kind of printed material. And then also you've got the fact that they could be read out to other people, so that extends that a little bit further. But you can tell from the texts themselves, and I should say that my approach to these is that I do a lot of close reading and rhetorical analysis to try and get out what the intent of the author is and what they think that their audience expects in that they're writing that. And they do a lot of things like say, to gentlewomen and ladies, or for instance, they might give a list of testimonials, and this is a big part of one of their like rhetorical strategies for credibility, is that they'll have a list of testimonials and they'll probably rank them on the page in order of your social rank. So it's like, the son of the Duke of Marlborough wears my Adenine necklace, which is a necklace of peony wood that is supposed to prevent teething pains, and because in this period you thought that a lot of children died of teething because they died at that time.
So this gives a kind of authority and a kind of social status almost to the practitioner.
Yes, definitely. And then to the product, which is like sort of trying to elevate them into the status of like a luxury good.
So it seems to me, I mean, from talking about these being read aloud and from talking about kind of these social circles that are then represented in print, that these are very much texts which, they're not the kind of thing that you're meant to be leafing through in a library. These are things that exist in the world and that act on the world, people reading them and using them.
Yeah.
So what I'm getting at is how does that tell us a bit more about medical practice at the time and medical culture? I mean, is it performative in this way? Is it?
Okay, this is something I'm trying really hard to get at. Okay, because people use this term, the medical marketplace. But what did that medical marketplace look like? People are using this term to talk about elite physicians, and that's really you're thinking about a sort of medical transaction that takes place in the room of a nobleman or something like that. I'm not dismissing that, but I'm trying to get away from it to look at like the vast world of the marketplace beyond that. And so the first thing that I want to do, coming at this from the sources, as I have done, is be like, where are these being distributed? Where did you see these? And I have a couple of quotes just like sort of paint for you the picture of like the medical marketplace. So probably the most well-known way that people might have heard of these is from Daniel Defoe's Journal of a Plague Year, which is written about the beginning of my period, but written at the end of my period. So it sort of encapsulates it. He's describing sort of this little bit that I'm going to read out comes in the context of a larger sort of polemical bit in a Journal of a Plague Year against sort of quack doctors taking advantage of this sort of hysteria during the plague year.
And this is which year exactly, sorry?
So he's talking about 1665, so the last plague in England. Well, I didn't know at the time it was going to be the last one, but
Yeah, of course.
and so he says, it is incredible and scarce to be imagined how the posts of houses and corners of streets were plastered over with doctors' bills and papers of ignorant fellows quacking and tampering in physic and inviting people to come to them for remedies. For a long time, that was the only sort of contemporary reference I had to get me into these. But
it's such a vivid image to
it
see
is,
this
isn't
kind
it?
of, to see posts literally plastered with advertisements. And
Yeah.
It makes you think of the Plague City, because you think of boarded up doors and you think of people staying indoors, and actually it's a totally other culture happening on the streets.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Now I think of print blowing down the street as well.
Oh my God, yeah.
Shouting plague, antidote for the plague, and so on and so forth. And I just recently found, and I'm incredibly excited about this, I found some more quotes from a nice long treatise on the venereal disease by a man named John Martin, published first in 1704, but the version I'm using is from 1708 because it's got a bit more of the juicy stuff in it.
It's good bedside reading.
Oh, definitely, yeah. It's on Google Books, actually.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so anybody can go along and read it. And I should add that it is a little bit racy. He was had up on pornography charges for it, because he goes into detail of the ways in which you can catch venereal disease
Yes.
and the
Not
different
how to, but
acts which will or will not lead to infection.
I see.
Yeah, in quite graphic detail. And I should say he was acquitted.
Really?
Because he said, this is necessary to put this information out there, which, is perhaps something that modern sex education is echoing somewhat.
That's interesting as well. If you listen carefully, you can hear the sound of frantic Googling.
John Martin's treatise of the venereal disease. And so, as you might imagine, that he's a little bit more graphic in his medical detail. He's also slightly more graphic in his descriptions of these being passed out. And again, these are in the context of a polemic against people who are quacking and tampering in physic. And he's talking about the distribution of bills specifically. And he says, others there are that only adorn pissing places, posts and doors, corner houses and thoroughfares, with their deluding quack impertinence. One of which presents you with a fallible story of 3 infallible cures in Fenchurch Street. So this is what I'm saying, they have these testimonials, and it's sort of this real immediacy when they say, I have cured so-and-so of this lane, who you can go and see and ask him about me. And this is like sort of putting into print a sort of word of mouth recommendation that you would get perhaps outside of an urban area where everybody knows everybody, but is made necessary to be put into print when you come into this sort of urban context.
And it's a way of creating authority as well, and to say, well, obviously this works because you can go and knock someone up and say, well, did it work for you?
Exactly.
So obviously for these practitioners, it's crucial for them to to appear credible, to appear reliable, and for people to know that that the cures that they offer actually work. Can you give us an idea of how people actually construct this kind of credibility?
Okay, well, there's all the usual ways. They say, I've got a degree from Oxford or Cambridge, or I've got a degree from Leiden, something like that. And they'll give the testimonials that I was talking about before, and refer you to someone else who can tell them. But there are other ways that they do so. And something I'm trying to get at is this idea of sort of empirical knowledge and witnessing, because this is in the context of the time of the rise of the Royal Society, and so some of them are using these sort of empirical witnessing sort of strategies.
So an increasing interest in what we would call experiment.
Exactly. Of seeing is believing.
Yes.
Okay.
So not just taking authority from books and people who've come before, but actually...
Or even from taking somebody else's word for it through a testimonial. Trying to get that physicality of it. And one way in which they do this, I've got one series of bills. The one I was talking about before, I had one bound into another book, where he uses little images all the way around the outside as a frame for the text, which is pictures of him performing operations, cutting off a cancerated breast, and trepanning somebody's skull. And my personal favourite, and this is one that he changes the images a little bit round, but this is one he always keeps. I think he's really proud of this operation. Removing a tobacco pipe from somebody's tongue. So, you probably imagine a little ceramic, pottery, but probably unglazed pottery and very cheaply made tobacco pipe, and it shattered and impaled the guy's tongue.
Oh,
and so he's having an operation to remove it, and it's a little tiny woodcut of this.
And he thought back
on his bill. He was like, that was a
successful
successful operation.
You wonder if it was a common injury as
well. You would think, wouldn't you?
Bite down too hard.
Yeah. To get back to this idea of something really tangible, because even a drawn image or a woodcut image like that isn't a very tangible thing. I have this one that's one of my favourite examples, that's about something that you could actually go and see and touch, and it's a very short one. It's one of these ones I was telling you about that's just a little bit larger than business card size, and it says, by His Majesty's authority at the, and it's blank so you could fill it in, so this is probably like a travelling exhibition, is to be seen 2 monsters, which by medicines prescribed by Madame Gooden in Goodman's Fields to Robert Cobb, labourer, who lives in the White Horse Alley in Barbican, labouring under an unknown distemper for several years, and having been given over by many physicians, was by her medicines and God's assistance delivered of one monster on the 9th of October 1695, like a lion, and another one on the 5th of June 1696, like a fox, both of which he vomited up at the mouth and are now here to be seen. So you could actually go and see these objects and handle them, well, presumably, because we know of, in more detail, of another similar case of vomited monsters, which Robert Hooke went to see and drew. And I should say that we're not really sure what these are, but we think that they're probably not alive, but they might have been some sort of substance that was shaped and looked like an animal that was vomited up by this guy. But it's very hard for us to know exactly what it was.
Yeah. Amazing then, though, that the practitioner involved would take them and use them as evidence that if you've got monsters in you, I can help you.
Yeah. Or if you have generally an unknown distemper, you might want to try my medicines and see, if vomiting monsters brings you relief.
God, well, this is something that brings up, which I'm really keen to understand, is the way in which performance played a part in that. You are inviting people to see things,
it's a
and
spectacle,
to feel things. A spectacle. So is that a central part of medical culture at the time?
Well, I really think that it is, and it's something that's been missed out. Well, not entirely missed out. It's something that people have been sort of feeling their way around, and it's something that comes back to this idea of the Mountebank. So Mountebank, it's a word that literally means to mount a bank. You're standing up above the level of the crowd. So it's like a stage, perhaps an impromptu stage or a set-up stage. And these are sort of practitioners or people selling drugs that was set up in marketplaces. So here we're getting into like the physical medical marketplace. And like I have a little quote, quite a long quote, that I'd like to tell you about this. So this is again from John Martin's Treatise of the Venereal Disease. He does go on a lot.
It's the gift that keeps on giving.
It really is.
Giving what we
giving many examples of cases of the venereal disease and of cases of quackery.
Which we'll come to.
Which we'll come to, I'm sure. Okay. If you take a walk in an afternoon into Moorfields, there for your diversion, for it is really comical, you will see a Mountebank or empiric mounted on his stage. And it goes on for quite a while with a very sort of detailed description of this, this guy's telling you how many people he's cured and so on and so forth, addressing his numerous admirers with great ribaldry, incredible but with the vulgar. And then he goes on and talks about the medicines he has for sale, for a 12-penny packet, that for so small a matter as 1 shilling they should never be without those medicines. And for their better encouragement, the doctor presents them with a bottle of his royal styptic into the bargain, and so dismounts his stage. After which, his Merry Andrew, and this is sort of like a comical, sort of like a, think of like a king's fool sort of person who sort of assists the performance. So the Merry Andrew, the doctor's interpreter, distributes his nonsensical bills into the auditory. So here's the bills again being handed out in the audience, which begins by Her Majesty's permission and so on, and wherein he recites the cures he pretends to have performed.
Oh wow! So we see these documents that you're looking at now in this kind of performative context, literally with a stage, with a clown, so as part of this much bigger.
And there were often monkeys, I should point out.
Monkeys as well.
Yes.
Who would the Mountebank would have one with?
Yeah.
So when you see the monkey, it's good medicine.
You can actually find these in like licenses for setting up your stage. It's like license for 1 stage with monkey.
Oh, fantastic! Evidently, these kind of performative practices are everywhere. I mean, they're in marketplaces, they're in Moorfields. Are they just on the street as well?
Oh yeah, definitely. So the bills, I think that are themselves performative. And so first of all, let me like sort of set the scene a little bit on the street. So it's not just that these are being posted on walls and handed out in the context of performances. They're also being handed out on the street. And it took me a long time to find this. So this is very like, I work on printed ephemera, and these are ephemeral practices as well. They're things that, don't often get recorded. But I was really excited to find this one. So once again, John Martin is talking about quacks, and he says, great variety of these pretenders is the word in the world at this time, pestered with insomuch that a man shall hardly pass the streets any day of the week, but a printed bill of their bombast and nonsense is offered to your acceptance. 1 thrusts a bill into your hands of Electrarium Mirabile, direction to Princes Street, 2 pots of which it tells you seldom fails, or rather seldom but fails, of making a perfect cure. For 8 or 10 of that tailor's, or as some say footman's pots, those are insults by the way, were so far from curing a certain gentleman I know, who unfortunately was hooked in to make a trial thereof, that they rendered him much worse, and that after many other medicines by that quack administered to him according to his most profound skill, when his wonder-working electry would not do, was notwithstanding reduced to such an extreme emaciated condition as to be obliged to commit himself to the care of an artist, who by proper methods and medicines quickly and perfectly restored him. And in case you hadn't guessed, the artist in question is the author.
Yes, of course. That's it. I mean, that's interesting to think of the streets, you know, having flyers and bills handed to you, and of course the terrible things that can emerge there.
Yeah, I'd just like to get back to this idea of them as performative, like in themselves. So I like to think of the doctors who are writing these bills sort of kind of performing credibility. One of the ways in which they do that is very, very bad poetry.
Oh, yeah, fantastic.
So there's a very...
You've got an example
I do have some. There's this guy called John Gallagher, and he is very much one for bad poetry. He's also very much one for what I would say look layouts that look very modern. He uses like screamer headlines and little pointing hands and so on and so forth to draw your attention to different parts of the text. But he cannot go past a piece of bad poetry. And I'm just going to read you a little bit here, which I think is really great because it gives you a kind of an idea about how contested this practice was. Mm-hmm. So we've seen how John Martin is talking about how quacks are the ones who hand out bills, which is a little bit questionable because he does very similar things himself. But John Case is obviously somebody who's getting stick for this, an awful lot. And so he says explicitly in his bills, he addresses these people and he says, "Yet some conceited fools will ask how he came to be able to do such great cures and to know how to make such rare and powerful medicines, and wherefore doth he publish the same in print? But he will answer such dark animals thus: It hath so pleased God, the King of heaven, being he to him hath knowledge given, and in him there can be no greater sin than to hide his talent in a napkin. His candle is light, and he would not under a bushel put it, let the world wonder, though he be traduced by such like tools as have knaves' hearts, like brains are fools."
Oh wow, it's not really poetry for the ages, but it's interesting that this kind of fits in, as you're saying, to this performative culture. Now, something that keeps coming up, what you've been talking about, is this word quack, and the idea that maybe there are quacks, maybe there are doctors. Obviously, this is maybe not as simple as it might seem. Do you want to tell us a bit about the term quack and what it means for you? Okay,
well, it's a very complex question, really. So quack is a term that I'm trying so hard to get away from. So just to call back the historiography I was talking about at the beginning here, about the different institutions, and how we're trying to get away from that, because it doesn't really fit for this period. The closer you look, the messier the picture gets. You know, these are not straightforwardly surgeons, apothecaries, doctors. They're people who might present themselves like a doctor in that they have sort of university level knowledge. They put little bits of Greek on things and so on and so forth, or little bits of Latin to show that they like display their erudition. But then they also perform surgery, like John Russell, who I was talking about with the tobacco pipe through someone's tongue, and they sell medicines. So they're kind of across these divisions. So how do we get to a word for the people who do all of these things and who advertise? And something that people have done a lot in historiography is use the term quack. And it has been acknowledged that this term is really problematic, but they tend to use it anyway. And I have to say, I sympathise. If I put the word quack in my conference paper title, I have twice the audience as if I don't put the term quack. But it's something that I think the term is uselessly pejorative. It's something that is only used as an insult. You are never a quack. Other people are a quack. And it's actually a very common sort of rhetorical strategy in these texts to sort of frame yourself against the quack. You say everybody else is a quack.
But I'm a doctor.
But I'm a doctor.
Yeah. And that's interesting when you talk about institutional histories as well. It's very dangerous for us to start thinking, well, there's the physicians and they're the doctors, there's the men on the street and they're the quacks. Presumably that's what we want to get
away
from.
I'm trying so hard to get away from that. And my solution to this, I'm not saying it's a great solution, but it's the one that I'm using, is to kind of get back to the sources, because so much history that we do tends to not acknowledge where we're getting this stuff from, okay? And so, we have the institutional division because we had institutional records, or because physicians are the people that write or are written about because they're working at elite levels. And so I talk about my practitioners with the term that they use themselves for what it is that they do, i.e. advertise, and they call themselves public practitioners. They say things like, I would like to defend this public way of practice, because, even though it has been brought into disrepute, and I'm actually paraphrasing the bill here when I say this, that other people who are disreputable have done it, I think that it's important. And they use a lot of rhetoric of sort of public good. I'm doing it for the good of the people, that they can access good medical care this way. And so I'm trying to get more towards a way of talking about these people that acknowledges how we get at them, rather than, these sort of unhelpful, polemical categories.
And obviously public practitioners is helpful as well, because it emphasises for us the fact that this is public, this is performative. Yeah. Now, something that you mentioned earlier on, I think in keeping with going back to the sources, is you've mentioned that there's a lot of close reading in what you do. And I thought, well, given you said that, would you like to maybe introduce us to one document or set of documents that you've used in that way, and maybe walk us through the kinds of reading that you're doing?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so for this, I would like to tell you about a very fascinating subset of these. So one of my arguments about them is that I think this is quite an established concept to distribute handbills, even though the ones that we have in these collections that I work on are like the earliest substantial collections and some of the earliest medical handbills that we have. I am sure this practice starts earlier. There are sort of mentions in judicial records of people doing it. So I'm making an argument about the establishment of genre. And one of the first things you have with an established genre is subversions of that genre. And I have a subset of these sources which are satires. And some of them are so subtle to like the modern eye that like the one I'm going to talk about now was actually originally catalogued as genuinely by the practitioner that it's satirizing. So what it is a very small bill that kind of at a quick glance you would think was advertising a drug for sale, right? And so I'll read it out to you. And it says, whereas it hath of late been the endeavour of several members of the Physicians' College to reform the abuses of the apothecaries, as well in the prices as in the composition of their medicines, this is to give notice for the public good, that a superfine sort of Jesuit's bark, that's quinine, which is used to treat fevers, ready powdered and papered into doses, with or without directions for the use of it, is to be had at Dr. Charles Goodall's, at the Coach and Horses in Physicians' College in Warwick Lane, at 4 shillings per ounce, and that's a lot of money, or for a quantity together, for the reasonableness of which prices, considering the loss and trouble in powdering, we appeal to all druggists and apothecaries themselves in town, and particularly to Mr. Thayer, druggist in Newgate Street, to whom we paid full 9 shillings per pound for a considerable quantity for the use of ourselves and our friends. And for the excellency and efficacy of this particular bark, inquire of Dr. Morton in Greyfriars. I am to be spoken with at Pears at St. Sepulchre's every day, but the Lord's Day at 7 in the morning, and at home from 8 in the morning till 10 at night. The poor may have advice, that is nothing for nothing.
So tell us a little bit about this piece of satire.
It's really deadpan, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's quite hard to, for the modern ear to see where the jokes are coming from, because we're missing the context.
Yeah, and I think that's something that is really what motivates me to look at these satires, because, if you can look at that gap of like why we're not getting the joke, then you can see what we're missing out on in looking at the point of view of these early modern people. So the first thing I'd like to say is that there is like a whole background to this, which I'm not going to go into, but that basically all the people who are name checked in this, like Dr. Morton and so on and so forth, are like participating in a sort of dispute over a particular incident where Dr. Charles Goodall supplied Jesuit's bark to somebody. And more broadly, there's the dispute they're talking about with the apothecaries is that the Physicians' College is trying to regulate the apothecaries, which it may or may not really have the right to do, and also they're trying to sell their own medicine. So that's like that kind of background to it. But then there's all these little bits that you wouldn't realise are a joke, like the Coach and Horses. So like the addresses are often like, you know, like I mentioned before, the hand and urinal, like, or sign of the angel or things like that. The Coach and Horses, I'm pretty sure, is not an actual address. There's no actual sign at Physicians College in Warwick Lane of a Coach and Horses. This is a dig at physicians who... It's that kind of a common trope in jokes about them that they spend a lot of money setting up their Coach and Horses and then ride around town in great state in them. The footman thing is a bit of a dig as well, because there's a whole sort of pamphlet war in there as well. The one I want to draw your attention to is the close, which is kind of the moment where you really realise that something's going on here. And they say, the poor may have advice that is nothing for nothing. So this is like calling to a very common trope in them, where they often say, the poor may have advice for nothing and proper medicine at reasonable rates. And this is kind of like calling out Dr. Charles Goodall, who I might mention is a very eminent member of the College of Physicians, who writes a lot of polemic against quacks, and saying that he's a hypocrite, basically. And that is kind of played back in the fact that they say you can call for him at church. So he's making church, you know, a place of business. And it's all very, very suspect like that.
So it's an amazing way. That kind of close reading is a great way to get into the cultural conflicts at the time, and, you know, obviously to get an idea of how these major figures are being viewed as well. I think seem like a fascinating way to view big debates about medicine and commercial practice in one place. So just to finish up, I suppose the question is, with the rest of the PhD and maybe what comes next, what do you hope to find? What do you want to look for? And are there other questions and other projects you want to pursue coming out of this? Okay,
well, you know, I'm only getting on for halfway through my second year, so there's still a lot to do. At the moment, I'm working on this notion of performativity. It's something that's kind of quite new to what I'm doing, and having trouble getting to grips with it. And there's one particular case study which I'm hoping to lead on to, which is I have in the collection a short pamphlet put out by apparently a Dr. Alexander Beddoes, who we know is John Wilmot, the Earl of Rochester.
Oh, okay.
And this pamphlet was published during the time when he was exiled from the court.
Well, who is himself a famous syphilitic as well.
A famous syphilitic and playwright. So there's kind of these sort of intersections going on there. And it is a subject of great controversy as to whether or not he did or didn't practice, whether this is just a forum for him to feed off these debates about regulation and government, and that this pamphlet of his is actually a satire on good government and on court culture, is one reading of it, and that's something that I really want to get into and look at those sort of metaphors and so on. Which is really fascinating. We'll tie it to the much bigger questions of the period as well. Well, that's absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much, Michelle, for introducing us to these amazing sources. It's been great. Thanks for listening to this Cambridge PhDcast, presented by me, John Gallagher, and produced by Richard Blakemore and Ruth Rushworth, and produced in association with CRASSH. If you'd like to hear more from us and for our fantastic collection of PhDcasters, please visit the CRASSH website at crash, that's with 2 S's, .cam.ac.uk. Thank you for listening.